Hello everyone and welcome back to eCoreAcademy. My name is Anita and I'm going to be your Java teacher for today's lesson. That lesson is called Compound If Statements and Booleans. So we're going to be wrapping up the lessons part of our conditional unit with this higher level application for conditionals. So with compound if statements, we're going to be learning about having conditionals with two parts, and these are really just two if statements combined together, and that's going to tie into Booleans. Booleans are really and or true-false operators, as you can see on the screen. They ask you the question, is something true or is it false? And depending on that, and depending on which one is used with these two if statements joined together, if that condition is now met, then the action will be executed. So now you have like two parameters you kind of have to meet for a block of code to be activated, and in order to do that, you will use compound if statements and or operators. So before we get into the lesson, I would really appreciate it if you all could like, subscribe, hit the post notification bell, drop a comment down below, and share using our socials. Okay, let's dive into what compound if statements are. So compound if statement, as you can see here on my notes, is a condition consisting of two if statements. Two if statements joined together, each with a different condition. These evaluate two or more conditions before the process continues. So if we as the user give the computer some kind of input, these compound if statements are going to check both of the if statements, both of the two if statements included, and ask, is the first condition met? Okay, is the second condition met? And we're going to evaluate if the first condition is true or false, or if the second condition is true or false, and then use both of those answers to decide an output. Both or one must be met for the statement to be true and the task to be met or done. So depending on if we use an and or an or operator, which I'll get into very, very shortly, one or both of those if statements in the compound if statement must be met for the code underneath to be activated and then that task to be executed. Lastly, it becomes an if ladder. So if we were trying to use multiple compound if statements, then instead of having an else if ladder, we would have just a ladder of if statements. So if blank and or blank, then we would put code underneath that, and if those conditions were both not met but we still want some kind of code to be activated, then we can include another compound if statement underneath it. So we would have just a ladder of if statements just going downward. So now let's get into what Boolean and logical operators are. So the moment you hear Boolean in any kind of computer class, just think a variable that has the value of true or false. It's not a normal variable where you could store a number, like an integer or a decimal, or maybe a character or a series of words, or a series of characters or words in it. This is a different kind of variable that stores whether something is true or false. And it's also called the logical operator because think of it as in like logic, as in we can compare values and tell if it's true or false. It's like that's where the kind of logical operator basis comes from. And there are two types we're going to be focusing on when it comes to compound if statements. The first are and statements, and the symbol for those are two ampersand signs. Make sure you have two because that's the correct syntax. Both if we use an and sign, both of the if statements in a compound if statement must be true for the code to be executed. Both must evaluate to true, or else that whole thing is false. Even if just one of those if statements in the compound if statement evaluates to false, the whole thing is false. On the other hand, if we use or statements, which are symbolized with two bar lines, these are the same lines you might type when you use like absolute value, but there are these two bars. Remember, again, the syntax is very important. This stands for an or statement, and at least one of the if statements must be true for the code to be executed. So kind of in opposition to what an and statement is, if you have two if statements and a compound if statement, but you use an or operator, just one of those have to be true for the code underneath to be executed. So one if statement is allowed to be false as long as the other is true. So one of them could be false, one of them could be true, the code underneath is still executed. Both if statements can also be true for the or operator to work. So at least one of them has to be true, but both of them don't have to be true. And in the best case, both of them might be true. So that's kind of, or statements give you a little bit more flexibility. And there are pros and cons to using each one. You'll get to a point where you can read a situation and understand which one is better to use. There are actually situations where you want a very, very specific condition to be met, and in those cases, you might want to use an and statement. Or if you want a little bit more flexibility where two different conditions could get you the same output, you could use an or statement. But we'll get into that more with the exercises. And here's a really quick chart for you to see kind of how these would evaluate to like a true or false Boolean kind of output. So if you use an and operator, if the first if statement is true, second one is also true, that's why I put TT, that would evaluate to true, which is T here. If the first if statement is true, second one is false, it's going to evaluate to false because both of these need to be true. Otherwise, it will just automatically evaluate to false. For the third one, if the first one's false, second one is true, still going to evaluate to false, and if both of them are false, it will obviously evaluate to false. On the contrary, if we use an or operator, if the two if statements evaluate to true, good, it's all true, and the code underneath will be executed. If the first one evaluates to true, the second one is false, then it'll actually evaluate to true because at least the first one is true. If the first one is false, second one is true, it'll still evaluate to true because at least one, which is the second one, is true. And lastly, if both are false, it's just going to automatically be false. So here's an example. You can see keyboard reader, meaning we're getting user input, we're declaring the int number, and we're printing guess a number, and then whatever the user enters will be stored in the integer or variable number. If the number is greater than 0 and the number is greater than or equal to 0 and the number is less than or equal to 100, we're just going to print you guess the right number. So we created this really big range. We use an if statement and we use operators here. We use the and operator, meaning both of these statements on the left and right have to be true. These are the two if statements. That's the first if statement. This is the second if statement. This is saying the number is going to be greater than or equal to 0. This is the number can be less than or equal to 100. So it has to essentially fall in the range of 0 to 100 inclusive. If it falls outside of that range, then this is not true. This evaluates to false. It's not going to print out you guessed the right number. So both of these if statements have to evaluate to true based on whatever input we put for number and whatever stored in number. If the number, let's say, is greater than 100, we're going to print out sorry, wrong number. So here I just create another if statement for anything over 100. We're not going to include negative numbers in this situation. Let's say we just enter over the range, then that's what's going to be printed out. So let me play this and guess a number. Let's say I put 50. You guess the right number. Say I even guess let's say 100. It's still the right number because this is less than or equal to. And then let's finally say 200, which is outside of the range. Sorry, wrong number. So that's essentially how the and statement, the and operators work. They created a range for us, a very strict range. So the number had to fall between 0 and 100 to be printed out as you guessed the right number. So that's essentially how these Booleans work and these compound if statements work. And that's it for the lesson. I hope you enjoyed. If you did, please make sure to like, subscribe, hit the post notification bell, drop a comment down below, and share using our socials. In the second half of this unit on conditional statements, we will be jumping into really good exercises for you to follow along with, so I hope you're ready for that. Bye!